Close your eyes and imagine the wide Nebraska sky of 1906, a dome of deepest indigo scattered with more stars than any city dweller could ever dream of. In the small town of Nevada, Missouri, a boy named John Marcellus Huston was born on the 5th of August, but his restless spirit was formed elsewhere on the road, under the great open heavens of the American heartland. His father was a man of the stage, a vaudeville actor and singer whose voice could fill a theater, and his mother was a newspaper reporter who chased stories across the plains. Little John was passed between them like a cherished keepsake, traveling from town to town on dusty trains, learning to sleep in a different room every week. The boy would lie on his back in the summer grass and gaze upward, feeling the immense silence of the universe press down like a velvet blanket. Those nights planted something deep inside him, a feeling that life itself was a grand, unpredictable story, and that he was meant to live it in wide, sweeping paragraphs. His father, Walter Huston, was a towering figure in more ways than one. On stage, he could make an audience laugh or weep with the tilt of his head, and young John watched from the wings, memorizing every gesture, every pause, every rise and fall of his father's voice. But the theater was not a school, and the boy's formal education was as scattered as dandelion seeds. He attended one school after another in Minnesota, Texas, and California, each time arriving as the new boy who knew strange songs and could mimic any accent. The other children found him odd and fascinating, a wiry kid with enormous dark eyes and a pocketful of sketches. John learned to observe rather than to belong. He drew constantly, capturing faces in charcoal, a habit that would later serve his filmmaking eye. Yet nothing held his attention quite like the cinema, a new art form that was just beginning to flicker in Nickelodeon halls. When he first saw a moving picture, the silver light painted his face with wonder, and he understood that here was a canvas big enough for all his dreams. By the time he was a teenager, John had become something of a rolling stone himself. A brief stint as a boxer under the name Eugene O'Brien taught him the craft of pretending to be hurt while staying very much alive inside. He was tall and lean, with a swagger that hid a keen intellect. But his health was fragile. A heart murmur sent him away from the ring and back to the open road. He wandered, taking odd jobs, working as a writer for the Mexican cavalry in the desert, and later as a reporter for his mother's newspaper. The desert nights were even grander than the ones in Nebraska. In Mexico, he learned to listen to the silence between words, the way a campfire story unfolds slowly under a canopy of lantern-bright stars. Those formative years were like a long, quiet prologue. He gathered faces, voices, and landscapes into a mental scrapbook, never knowing that they would one day find their way into the most unforgettable movies Hollywood ever made. But the boy under the stars was also a boy in search of a story that was uniquely his own. He drifted to New York and fell into the bohemian circles of Greenwich Village, where painters and poets argued through the night about art and truth. There, he met a young woman named Dorothy Harvey and married her quickly, as if checking off a chapter heading. The marriage was short-lived, a sketch rather than an oil painting. Still restless, he sailed to Paris in the late 1920s, living in a tiny garret and studying painting at the Académie Julian. The left bank air was thick with cigarette smoke and ambition. He wandered the Louvre, staring at the old masters, learning about light and shadow from Rembrandt and Goya. Those lessons would return decades later, when he framed his actors' faces like old portrait paintings, each wrinkle telling a life story. But Paris could not hold him either. The Great Depression sent him home, and with it came a new urgency to earn a living. Back in America, John stumbled into the one place that could harness all his scattered talents, the moving picture business. He began not as a director, but as a writer, crafting dialogue for Universal Pictures, and then for the mighty Warner Brothers studio. The boy who once lay in the grass counting stars now sat in a cramped office, a single lamp burning, turning real-life newspaper stories into script after script. His mother's journalist spirit lived in every line he typed. He worked on films about desperate men, betrayed women, and hard-boiled detectives, infusing them with a rough poetry that caught the attention of the studio bosses. Yet the writer's lamp was only a stepping stone. In his heart, he was already staging scenes, hearing the music and seeing the camera move. He craved the director's chair, the absolute command of a world built from light and shadow. And he was about to seize it in a way that would change Hollywood forever. The path was paved with both failure and stubborn determination. Before his directorial debut, he co-wrote a stilted serial called Dr. X and contributed to the sharp-tongued Jezebel, but he yearned for a story that matched his own inner landscape. Late at night, after the typewriters fell silent, he would walk through the Warner Brothers lot, past the false fronts of New York streets and Western saloons, breathing in the sawdust and paint. The artificial stars pinned to the soundstage ceilings reminded him of the real ones he'd known as a boy. He realized then that every image he had ever beheld, the desert's gold, a boxer's footwork, his father's commanding gaze, could be woven into the fabric of a motion picture. All he needed was a story that demanded to be told in this new, intimate language. That story was waiting in a slim novel about a private detective and a blackbird. So, as we drift into the quiet of a Hollywood night, imagine that young John Huston, still more wanderer than auteur, standing at the threshold of a soundstage, a script tucked under his arm. The boy who had been cradled by the Nebraska stars was now a man preparing to reach out and place new constellations onto a silver screen. His voice, gentle and deliberate, would soon guide actors through scenes steeped in moral shadows and raw human longing. And in just a little while, the whole world would sit in darkened theaters and gaze up at his stories, just as he once gazed up at the silent, pulsing sky. Sleep now and let the first chapter of his extraordinary life settle into your dreams like dust motes in a projector beam, soft, golden, and full of promise. Picture a small, windowless room on the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, sometime around 1938. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the faint ghost of yesterday's coffee. In the center of the clutter sits a man with a hawk-like profile, a pencil tucked behind his ear, and a lamp casting a warm pool of yellow light across a stack of paper. This is John Huston at the writer's desk, where the boy who once roamed under open skies now lives by the clock. He is no longer a wanderer. He is a studio scribe, one of the anonymous craftsmen who feed the Hollywood machine. The lamp is his constant companion, burning late into the night as he transforms novels, newspaper clippings, and half-remembered anecdotes into blueprints for dreams. It is here, under that dedicated circle of light, that he will forge the words that introduce a new kind of American hero, flawed, weary, and vibrantly alive. His first major success as a writer came when he adapted a thriller by W.R. Burnett called High Sierra, a story about an aging gangster named Roy Earl who longs for one last job before disappearing into the mountains. Huston poured everything he had learned from his mother's newspaper work into the script, the rhythm of tough talk, the tenderness hidden beneath a criminal's leather jacket, the ache of a man out of his time. He gave Roy Earl a sense of doomed poetry. When Humphrey Bogart read the part, he understood immediately that this was unlike any role he had played. The film, released in early 1941, was a hit and Bogart became a star. Suddenly, the writer with the quiet, raspy voice was no longer invisible. Jack Warner saw something unpredictable in Huston's pages, a rebel intelligence that could either be a studio's greatest asset or a constant headache. He offered the younger man a chance to direct. What happened next is one of those Hollywood fairy tales that actually came true. Huston chose to adapt a novel by Dashiell Hammett called The Maltese Falcon, a labyrinthine story of double crosses, greed, and a mysterious black statuette. He sat beneath his lamp and wrote the screenplay with a precision that bordered on obsession. He wanted every line to be lifted directly from the book, preserving Hammett's razor-sharp dialogue. In the margins, he drew sketches of how each scene should be framed, close-ups tight as a fist, low angles that made the characters loom like giants. He knew this was his one shot. When he handed the script to the executives, he included detailed storyboards and a note promising he would not waste a single foot of film. The studio took a chance, giving him a modest budget and a leading man, Bogart, who had recently been typecast as a gangster. The lamp had burned for weeks, and now the story was ready to leap from the page into the light. On the set of The Maltese Falcon, in the summer of 1941, Huston did something revolutionary. He stuck to his script as if it were a sacred text. He rehearsed with the cast like a theater director, insisting on the exact timing of each biting remark, each pregnant pause. Mary Astor, Peter Lorre, and Sidney Greenstreet assembled around Bogart's Sam Spade as if they had been performing these roles for years. Huston's set was calm, almost meditative. He spoke in low, measured tones, never raising his voice, creating an atmosphere of focused trust. The crew marveled. A first-time director was supposed to be nervous, but Huston moved with the quiet authority of a man who had seen 1,000 scenes in his head long before the camera rolled. He turned the writer's lamp into a projector beam, and in doing so, he birthed a masterpiece of film noir, a genre that he did not invent, but which he perfected on that very first try. The film opened in October, and critics immediately recognized something new. The dialogue crackled like a radio play from a morally uncertain universe. Bogart's Spade was both hero and antihero, a man who could take a beating and then straighten his tie with a weary smile. The audience felt the presence of a distinct authorial voice, one that blended Hammett's hard-boiled prose with Huston's own dark humor and deep empathy for broken people. The movie became an instant classic. At the age of 35, John Huston was no longer just a writer. He was an overnight success who had been preparing for this his entire life. He had translated the rhythms of his restless youth, the boxer's footwork, the painter's eye, the reporter's ear, into a seamless visual language. And yet, he never abandoned the writer's lamp, understanding that a director's first duty is to the word, to the story, to the quiet miracle that happens when a perfectly chosen phrase falls into the right actor's mouth. Emboldened by his triumph, Huston now moved deeper into the terrain he loved best, stories of men and women chasing elusive fortune in unforgiving landscapes. He next chose to adapt B. Traven's novel, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, a parable of gold and madness set in the Mexican mountains. Before writing a single line, he returned to the desert where he had once ridden with the cavalry, to listen again to the wind and remember the way the sun bleached everything of pretense. He convinced his father, Walter Huston, to take the role of the old prospector Howard, the grizzled heart of the story. The script he crafted was lean, poetic, and unflinching. It gave Walter the words that would win him an Academy Award and gave John his second consecutive Oscar nomination for screenwriting. The writer's lamp shone now on a father and son creating something eternal, a film that would echo through the decades as a meditation on greed, loyalty, and the human soul. There were other stories, too, that poured from the light of that lamp. Huston wrote or co-wrote nearly all of his own films, a rare feat in the assembly line system of old Hollywood. He adapted Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, bringing a poetic realism to the Civil War that few had dared. He wrestled with Herman Melville's White Whale for Moby Dick, writing a screenplay that some called brilliant and others called unfilmable, but which he pursued with obsessive passion. Even when directing films scripted by others, he could not help but rewrite, retool, and reshape them to fit his particular vision of flawed humanity. The writer in him was never separate from the director. They were two sides of the same coin, spinning in the air like the flip of a dime in a darkened theater. And so, as we leave John Huston for this evening, let us picture him once more beneath that single lamp, the rest of the world dark and quiet around him. The typewriter keys are still, perhaps, or maybe he is reading by the bulb's low glow, a pencil moving across a page like a gentle or through still water. He knows that tomorrow the words will become images, the images will become emotion, and the emotion will travel through the silver screen into the dreams of millions. But for now, it is just the man, the lamp, and the patient unfolding of a story. Close your eyes and let that image be your own softening light. Let the hum of his work carry you into the deep, restful sleep that every storyteller earns at the end of a long night's labor. The writer's lamp is still burning, but you may turn away now, dream sweetly, and leave him to his quiet craft. In the autumn of 1941, John Huston stood for the first time on a soundstage as a director. The film was The Maltese Falcon, and the set had been built to look like a San Francisco detective's office. The lights were positioned high above, immense carbon arc lamps that would soon paint sharp shadows across the actors' faces. But for now, the stage was in half-light, a cathedral of silence. The crew moved slowly, speaking in murmurs. There was a feeling almost religious in the air, as if they were not making a movie but preparing a small, careful ritual. The director's chair was a simple canvas folding seat with his name stitched on the back. He did not sit in it much. Instead, he walked the set, running his hand along the edge of a wooden filing cabinet, feeling the grain of the fake leather on the office sofa. He believed in the texture of things, in the way a prop telephone receiver felt cool to the touch. Every physical detail had to be right, because the camera would see it all. But more than the objects, he cared about the light. He would ask the gaffer to bring a spotlight down just a few inches to soften the edge of a shadow falling across Humphrey Bogart's weary expression. The subtle change would transform an ordinary shot into something that felt like a memory. Working with actors was also a quiet art. John Huston would sit next to them, not opposite, and speak in a low, steady tone. He never shouted. He would describe a scene not in terms of emotion, but in terms of action and sense, how the air smelled after rain, how the stomach tightens when a lie is about to be told. Bogart, playing Sam Spade, would nod thoughtfully, take a drag from a cigarette, and then step into the light. There was a mutual respect that needed few words. The set became a kind of sanctuary where performers felt safe to reveal fragile truths. During long setups, when the camera was being moved or a new lens fitted, Huston would retreat to a corner and sketch on a small pad. He drew the scene they were about to film, not as a storyboard, but as a painting. The composition mattered to him, the curve of a hat brim, the placement of a vase, the way light caught the rim of a drinking glass. These sketches were never shown to anyone. They were private meditations, a way to quiet his mind and see the image purely. He carried the habit with him across decades and continents, a portable piece. The lighting rigs hummed overhead, and the great black camera sat on its dolly like a patient animal. The cinematographer, Arthur Eaton, shared Huston's love for deep shadow and slanted light. Together they created a visual language that would become known as film noir, though neither thought much about labels. To them it was simply the right way to tell a story about moral fog and hidden motives, by letting the darkness have its say. They used what is called low-key lighting, with one strong source carving forms out of gloom, leaving the rest to mystery. It was a world of half-revealed faces and glinting metal, as meditative as a Renaissance chiaroscuro. And then there were the quiet hours after a day's shooting, when everyone else had gone home and Huston lingered. He would walk the empty set alone, listening to the creak of the wooden floor under his own weight. The props, a half-empty glass of whiskey, a tarnished brass lamp, rested where they had been left, holding the residue of the scene. In that solitude, he would replay the day's work, not with anxiety, but with a gentle curiosity. He'd sit in Sam Spade's chair and look out at the soundstage, now dark and vast as a cave, feeling a deep gratitude for having found this strange, beautiful trade. The Maltese Falcon would turn out to be a perfect crystal of a film, hardened and luminous. But for Huston, the true reward lay in the process itself, the hushed concentration, the careful placement of each visual element, the unspoken understanding between the crew. He had discovered that directing was not about control, but about orchestration, about holding a space where all the separate notes, light, shadow, sound, and silence, could harmonize. And as the first print rolled through the projector in a small screening room, he leaned back in his seat, folded his hands, and smiled at the slow, sure miracle they had all made together. The road to Tampico was long and dusty, winding through a Mexican landscape of cactus and pale rock. John Huston rode in an open car, a wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes from the fierce sun. The year was 1947, and he was searching for locations for the treasure of the Sierra Madre. The world here felt ancient, stripped down to its essential elements, earth, sky, and the slow pulse of heat. Every curve in the road revealed a new vista of silent, sun-bleached hills. He felt a profound peace in this remoteness, a feeling that he had traveled not just south but back in time. The town itself was a jumble of whitewashed buildings with red-tiled roofs, their walls flaking gently in the dry air. The central plaza featured a stone fountain where water trickled with a sound like faraway laughter. Huston chose a spot just outside town for the camp scenes, a place where the horizon stretched unbroken and the only company was the occasional buzz of a cicada. His father Walter would play the old prospector, and the opportunity to work side by side with him in this elemental setting filled John with a quiet, deep delight. They would share coffee at dawn, sitting on folding chairs, watching the sky turn from gray to rose. Filming in the Mexican desert was an exercise in patience. The crew had to wait for the light to be just so, the low-angle morning beams that made the dust look like gold, or the softer afternoon glow that sculpted the mountains in gentle relief. Huston never rushed. He let the desert dictate the pace. Between setups, he would walk off a little way, pick up a piece of weathered stone, and examine its surface. The whole landscape seemed to whisper of endurance. The actors, too, felt the slow rhythm seep into their performances. Bogart, as the paranoid prospector Dobbs, found something raw and unpolished within himself, coaxed out not by words, but by the unrelenting stillness of the desert. The nights were the most beautiful time. When the sun set behind the Sierra Madre, the sky blazed orange and violet before cooling into a deep velvet studded with countless stars. The crew would gather around a campfire, speaking little, listening to the crackle of mesquite. Walter Huston sometimes recited lines of verse, his voice rolling softly through the dark. John would lean back in his chair, a cigarette glowing faintly, and feel an overwhelming gratitude for this moment, the stars, the fire, his father's voice. No movie premiere could ever rival such simple majesty. Years later, in 1951, another landscape captured his imagination, the winding rivers of Central Africa for the African Queen. The location was the Ruwiki River in the Belgian Congo, a place of dense green foliage and slow-moving water. The river was like liquid silk, reflecting the tangled branches of riparian trees. Mornings began with a fine mist rising from the surface, through which the small steam launch, the African Queen herself, puttered with endearing fragility. Huston set up the camera on a raft, floating quietly with the current, capturing the river's unhurried consciousness. The sound of water lapping against the hull became the film's true score. Between takes, he would watch the hippos wallowing in the shallows, their great bodies barely visible under the murky water. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and flowering plants. He took out his watercolors and painted the riverbank in soft washes of green and brown. Painting allowed him to see more deeply, to understand how the light filtered through the huge leaves and dappled the water's skin. Katharine Hepburn recalled years later that Huston looked happiest when he was by the river with a brush in his hand, a truly content man borrowed from the hustle of the world. Both films, one born of desert dust, the other of river mist, illustrated Huston's profound connection to the natural world. He never forced the landscape to be a mere backdrop. He invited it to be a character, patient and wise. After the long days of filming in Africa, when the sun had finally dipped below the green wall, the river seemed to exhale. In that gentle breathing out, as light surrendered to the soft chirrup of insects, John Huston would sit on the bank, letting the cool air wash over him, knowing that he had found another fragment of that starlit wonder he had first known as a boy. In the early 1950s, seeking a retreat from the demands of Hollywood, John Huston discovered a crumbling Georgian manor house in the west of Ireland. It was called St. Clarence, set in the County Galway countryside among ancient stone walls and fields that rolled gently toward the horizon. The moment he saw it, he felt a deep recognition, as if the land had been waiting for him. The house itself was pale gray stone, with tall windows that caught the soft Irish light, a light that seemed filtered through pearl and silver. He purchased the estate and began a slow, loving restoration, turning it into a sanctuary for his family, his paintings, and his horses. The rhythm of life at St. Clarence was unhurried. Mornings began with the sound of a kettle in the kitchen and the sight of mist rising from the paddocks. Huston would put on a thick wool sweater and walk the grounds, a pair of binoculars around his neck for watching the birds. The green of the fields was an extraordinary, layered green, broken only by gray stone outcrops and the occasional flash of a fox. He planted trees, oak, ash, beech, and watched them grow over the decades as his own children grew beside them. Time here was measured not in production schedules, but in the slow turning of seasons. A large barn on the property was converted into a painting studio. It had a north-facing skylight that admitted a steady, cool illumination, perfect for the observation of color. Inside, canvases leaned against the walls in various stages of completion. Huston painted portraits of neighbors, landscapes of the Bayou, and quiet, still lives of salmon and copper pots. He worked in oils, applying pigment in deliberate, unhurried strokes. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine filled the air, blending with the earthy scent of hay drifting in from the nearby stables. This was his true parallel career, one he pursued with the same integrity he brought to film. Horses were integral to the St. Clarence way of life. Huston bred and trained thoroughbreds, and the sound of hooves on gravel was a common music. Each afternoon, he would ride out along the winding lanes, passing fields dotted with black-faced sheep and ancient stone ring forts. The gentle rise and fall of the canter had a meditative quality. On horseback, he could think clearly, his mind settling into a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of the animal beneath him. Neighbors often saw him, a tall, lean figure in tweed, tipping his hat as he passed by, a genial custodian of a more gracious tempo. The manor itself was furnished with eclectic warmth, Mexican saddles thrown over upholstered chairs, books stacked on every surface, a massive hearth where turf fires burned through the damp Irish evenings. The turf, or peat, gave off a sweet, earthy smoke that crept into every corner. After dinner, guests would gather in the drawing room, its walls hung with paintings by friends and by the host himself. Conversation flowed gently about literature, travel, the funny misadventures of filmmaking. Huston sat in a high-backed chair, glass of whiskey in hand, looking more like a country squire of the old school than a Hollywood director. The world of premieres and studio politics felt a universe away. Even when film work called him back to distant locations, a part of him remained rooted in that Irish soil. He would bring back artifacts from his travels, a carved mask from Africa, a piece of pottery from Mexico, and weave them into the texture of the house. Each object carried a memory, but St. Clarence itself held them all in a gentle embrace. The long driveway, lined with ancient limes, welcomed him home after months away. The crunch of tires on gravel, the bark of a familiar dog, the creak of the old front door, these were the sounds that meant peace. In his later years, Huston spent more and more time simply sitting on a bench in the garden, watching the light change over the Connemara Mountains in the distance. The day would fade slowly, thanks to the long northern twilight, the sky refusing to fully darken until late into the evening. He found that this landscape required nothing from him except presence. The land itself was an old story, layered with myth and quiet resilience, and he felt profoundly grateful to be a small part of it. St. Clarence was not just a home, it was the place where his soul finally learned to exhale.